When Eric Perkins and I were preparing to go through the divorce process, he was in a car accident and lost his memory. His memory stopped at 8 years ago. 8 years ago, that was when he loved me the most. 1. Eric looked at me solemnly and asked me, "Grace Warren, tell me honestly, do you want a divorce because you have fallen in love with someone else?" I sighed tiredly and could only remain silent under his questioning. He forgot. The person who has been trying so hard to get a divorce is not me. The person who falls in love with someone else is not me. It's him. But Eric doesn't believe he will fall in love with someone else. He looked at me quietly while sitting on the bed, as if he was listening to some ridiculous nonsense. His eyes shifted from Ian beside me to me and he sneered and asked, "Did you deliberately team up to deceive me?" He was in a car accident and the blood accumulation in his brain compressed the surrounding nerve tissue, causing him to suffer temporary memory loss. He forgot everything that happened in the past 8 years. 8 years ago, when we had just graduated, I started a business with him and shared the hardships together. At that time, his heart and eyes were filled with me. If you told Eric at that time that he would fall in love with someone else, not only him but also me 8 years ago, would not believe it. 2. Emma Palmer, who was sitting next to him, wanted to hold his hand with tears in her eyes, but he avoided her. He frowned tightly and with suppressed impatience, he said to Emma in a very cold tone, "Stay away from me." Emma was stunned for a moment. Then she sat there with tears falling down her face. Of course, even with tears in her eyes, she did not forget to look up and glare at me, as if I was the instigator of all this. I actually wanted to laugh when I saw this scene, but I really couldn't. And Eric and I really have nothing to say to each other. I stood far away from his bed and said expressionlessly, "You instructed your legal team to draft the divorce agreement. Your chief lawyer carefully considered every word and finally gave it to you for review." I sighed and said, "After you are discharged from the hospital, you can ask the people around you whether I have lied to you." He raised his head and looked at me fixedly, as if he was hurt by my cold attitude. His expression showed rare hesitation and confusion, and also a hint of puzzlement and pleading. He has been very successful in recent years and has been confident in everything. I haven't seen such an expression on his face for a long time. But my heart had already become as stagnant as water. No matter how confused and hesitant he was, it could not move me. I paused, then turned around and left. 3. Eric was in a car accident a month ago, and he may have only woken up in the past few days. Probably because they were afraid of affecting the share price of Irving Technology, his accident was kept secret. I think if he hadn't encountered some minor problems, his chief assistant would never have called me to tell me about his car accident. The accident happened on the night I filed for divorce from him. The cause of the car accident was certainly not because he was upset after hearing me mention divorce, but because it was raining heavily in City B that night. He rushed back to China overnight after a meeting in Florence, hoping to catch Emma's birthday before 12 o'clock in the morning. As a result, he crashed into a bus that was driven tiredly and ran a red light on a rainy night. Wow, that's really touching. It wasn't until Eric regained consciousness after surgery that his assistant called me. Because Eric's memory stopped at 8 years ago, he didn't recognize everyone around him. 8 years ago, Emma had not yet appeared in his life. I'm the only thing he remembers. Eric has always been a smart man, calm and careful. Even in such a panic situation, he was able to accept the current situation and the basic situation of the company's development in a very short time. But there was one thing he just couldn't believe. He just didn't believe that he would change his mind and fall in love with Emma, and that he wanted to divorce me. His confidence in the company and Emma used a series of details about his and Emma's life to prove that he didn't believe it and insisted on meeting me. They had no other option, so they called me to tell me that Eric had been in a car accident. They invited me to the ward and displayed me in front of Eric as if I were evidence that my relationship with Eric was dead in name only. They wanted to use this to convince Eric that this really wasn't 8 years ago. Time has passed and it is already 8 years later. In all the details of those 8 years that he had forgotten, there was no mutual affection between us, only mutual hatred. As for how to believe and accept it, that is his own business. 4. It was half a month later that I saw Eric again. He probably came out of the hospital secretly. He was wearing a blue striped hospital gown and a gauze on his head. He was sitting on the ground at the door of my house in an ungraceful manner. I haven't seen him so unkempt since 5 or 6 years ago. He was an upstart in City A, always in a suit and tie, with the seams of his trousers as straight as if they were cut by a knife. His handsome face became more and more expressionless, and the higher he held a position, the more he learned to restrain his previously undisguised edge, becoming deep and solemn. Wherever he went, people would politely greet him as, "Hello, Mr. Perkins." He looks so unkempt now. The last time I saw him was when he had just graduated. He heard footsteps and looked up suddenly. At that time I had just picked up Max from school. His eyes slowly moved from me to Max beside me, then his expression moved slightly and his eyes became focused. He has always been smart and receptive. Even if he lost his memory of these 8 years, I think he should be able to know the general details of his life over the years from the retellings of people around him. He started a successful business, we got married and had children, but he changed his mind and fell in love with someone else, so I filed for divorce. I held Max's hand, stopped far away from him and asked indifferently, "What are you doing here?" He seemed to hold it in and asked, "Is he our child?" Max was not very close to him. He stood beside me, looking at Eric quietly and distantly, then looked up at me and called out, "Mom." I patted his head and said, "Go in and do your homework first." He looked at me, then at Eric, then nodded softly and went in with his school bag. 5. Eric watched him go into the house, then turned to look at me. His frown never relaxed. He asked in confusion, "I don't understand, Grace. Since college, my dream has been to marry you and have a child. Now my dream has come true, but..." He paused. I knew what he didn't say, but why the reality 8 years later was different from what he had imagined. He married me as he wished, but I was extremely cold to him, and even our children were alienated from him as their father. He tried hard to think about the memories, but the blood clot pressing on the brain nerves prevented him from doing so. He frowned tightly, probably because his head was hurting severely again. He raised his hand and rubbed his temple hard, then looked up at me with sad eyes, like a stray dog abandoned on the street, with genuine confusion in his eyes. He asked me in a painful tone, "Grace, I really don't understand why we have come to this point." I read the divorce agreement. They all said that I personally instructed them to write it. Every clause is harsh and ruthless. I don't understand why I should divorce you. Why? Because 8 years ago, Eric's biggest dream was to marry me. But Eric 8 years later. The biggest dream is how to convince me to divorce, then marry Emma and give her a legitimate status. 6. Eric and I's story is exactly the same. We fell in love in college. At that time, he was the president of the student union and represented the school to shoot a series of campus promotional videos, which mainly revolved around the theme of self-love, self-respect, and self-improvement for college students. In one chapter, he played a scumbag who deceived girls. I was passing by the exercise site at that time and didn't know it was a promotional video. I saw a girl hugging his arms tightly and crying, saying things like, "I'm pregnant, don't leave me, please." He frowned and said, "Go to the hospital and get an abortion, and don't bother me anymore." I was so angry that I walked over and threw the half-eaten ice cream in my hand on his face. Then I took the girl's hand and said indignantly, "Girl, it's not worth it to be with such a scumbag." The girl stopped crying and stared at me in amazement. He raised his hand to wipe the ice cream off his face, then looked at me with a half-smile, and turned to the students who were hiding in the woods and filming in amazement and said, "Yes, this is the value we convey in the chapter on self-love." I apologized repeatedly with my face red, but he was very generous. He waved his hand and said it was okay as if he didn't care. Later I apologized and treated him to a meal, and then we got together. Eric is a very qualified boyfriend. We have had many sweet memories and recollections. Of course we have quarreled, but every time he was the first to apologize. Once in my sophomore year when we went out to hike, I don't know why we had a fight. He was so angry that he felt dizzy. Maybe he was afraid that he would get emotional and start a fight with me, so he just kept walking forward alone. I couldn't catch up with him at all and soon I couldn't see him anymore. But I only climbed a few hundred meters of stairs when I saw him standing under a crooked tree not far away, waiting for me with suppressed anger. He had no way out at the time, so he suppressed his emotions and said, "Let me make it clear first, I'm still angry. I'm just afraid that you can't catch up with me." When they graduated, many couples couldn't escape the breakup curse, but he held my hand very firmly and said that we would definitely get married. After graduation, my parents found a good job for me back home. I had strong academic and personal abilities, but I was determined to stay with Eric. He had a difficult time in the early stages of his business and was unable to make ends meet. I lived with him in a basement that never saw the sun. When we ate a bowl of fried noodles together, he would always push the pitiful amount of shredded meat and vegetables in the noodles to my side. He said he wouldn't let me suffer forever. What happened next? Later he did it, and everything gradually got back on track. Then he met Emma. The minds of old friends change easily, yet they say that the minds of old friends are easily changed. In just 8 years he has changed so fast that I can't keep up with him. And now he no longer worries about whether I can catch up with him. 7. Before I met Emma, I actually heard Eric mention her a few times. The first time her name appeared on his lips, if I remember correctly, was 7 years ago. At that time, his company had just completed its series of financing. When he came back one night, he was very excited and told me that he had recruited an exceptional person. She is a returnee from a prestigious university, has strong professional skills, is capable and has her own opinions. Most importantly, her tone is full of uncontrollable excitement. He said, "Grace, you don't know, she understands my entrepreneurial philosophy. She said I will definitely succeed. She has already received several offers from Fortune 500 companies, but she finally chose to come to me." He looked genuinely happy at the time and he said, "She will definitely be a great help to me." I smiled and looked at him silently without saying anything. I think he must have forgotten that when he first started his business and everyone was calling him a liar, I was the one who always stayed by his side to encourage him. I believed he would succeed, and I never questioned him even when he occasionally doubted himself. I never thought that from then on, the name Emma would haunt Eric in my life for such a long time, and become a nightmare that I dared not even dream of. 8. Emma and I met for the first time 7 years ago. At that time, Eric's Irving Technology did not have a standalone building. More than a dozen people were crowded in a small office building in the Science and Technology Park. One night it was raining heavily and I went to pick up Eric after get off work. When we arrived at the company, Ian, his roommate who started the business with him, looked at me and laughed loudly. "Sister-in-law, wait a minute, Eric is in a meeting." I nodded, then stood outside the conference room and looked inside through the glass. There were about 6 or 7 people inside. Eric was writing densely packed formulas on a blackboard. The science students were arguing with each other, their faces red. They were arguing over a technical calculation formula. When they were at a stalemate, I saw Emma. She smiled and stood calmly beside Eric. She added a formula on the blackboard. The quarrelsome meeting room suddenly became silent. In the silence, I saw Eric lower his head and smile at her. Such tacit understanding. Eric was very surprised to see me when he came out of the conference room. He looked out the window and saw heavy rain. He asked, "Why did you come here in such heavy rain?" I didn't reply to him. My eyes passed over his shoulder and fell on Emma behind him. Emma stood there with a smile on her face, letting me look at her calmly, while also observing me calmly. I think this should be a sixth sense that only girls understand. Her invasion was so obvious. I smiled at her and said implicitly, "Hello, my name is Grace, Eric's girlfriend." She also smiled and said, "My name is Emma, Eric's assistant." Our first confrontation was silent. Eric stood beside me unaware, feeling sorry for me coming to pick him up in such a heavy rain. He lowered his eyes and asked me gently what I wanted to eat for dinner. I won the victory without making a sound. 9. Of course, looking back on that now is meaningless. Over the years that Emma and I have fought, I have won and lost. Until now, it's hard to say whether I won or lost. After I figured it out, I just found myself funny. There will also be days when I get tired and don't want to be tossed around between them anymore. So I filed for divorce. The day Eric and I filed for divorce was a very ordinary evening. I was standing on the balcony, watching the afterglow of the setting sun gradually fade away among the overlapping high-rise buildings not far away. Then I sent a message to Eric and said, "Eric, let's get a divorce." He didn't reply to my message for a long time, probably because he was busy. A few hours later, he replied me with a concise question mark. I stared at the phone screen, thought about it, and still didn't reply. In the evening, Eric probably called me directly because he saw that I hadn't replied to his message for a long time. We were silent in tacit agreement. He didn't ask me the reason for the divorce, nor did he try to persuade me to stay. After a long time, he told me, "I asked a lawyer to draft a divorce agreement." I hummed and hung up. I don't know why, but I recalled the time in college when the curfew was at 11 p.m., and I would talk to him on the phone for hours as if we would never finish talking. Now there is nothing to say. Shortly after the call ended, he had a car accident on his way to Emma's birthday. It was as if even God couldn't stand it and wanted to do justice for me. 10. The three of us, him, Emma, and I, have been entangled for too long. I don't think he ever thought that one day I would come to my senses and file for divorce. The moment I filed for divorce, he probably felt relieved. Because according to Eric's personality, bound by the damn sense of responsibility, even if he and Emma were in love with each other, he would not take the initiative to file for divorce with me. In fact, nothing special happened on the day I filed for divorce. It was just that Max's class teacher called me and asked me to go to school because he had a fight with some other kids again. When I went there, Max and a fat kid were standing against the wall. The other kid's father had already arrived. He was very burly and stood there looking at me with a frown on his face and said, "How do you teach your kids? Look at the way they beat you." Max looked up at me. He was covered in grass and dust, and his face was dirty. He looked at me stubbornly without saying a word. I walked over to him, squatted down, and silently wiped the dirt off his face with my fingertips, then asked in a low voice, "Why are you fighting?" He pursed his lips and said nothing. Seeing that I ignored him, the child's father pushed me hard on the shoulder from behind. I was caught off guard and fell forward. Before I could get up, Max rushed over like a little beast without making a sound, grabbed the man's thigh and bit him. The teacher in the office screamed, and the whole office was in chaos. When we left the school, the neon lights were just beginning to light up. Max and I were both in a state of panic. I held his hand, pointed at the window, and asked him, "Do you want some ice cream?" He stared at his toes and nodded. It was easy to coax a child. He was no longer so depressed when we drove back home. But just before we got home, he asked me, "Mom, where is Dad?" His eyes were a little red, and I knew he was wrong today. He was actually not a tearful person and was extremely stubborn at a young age. But when I was apologizing to that burly man in the office today, he was standing aside and suddenly burst into tears with a "wow." Even though he and Eric were never very close, I knew he wished his dad was here. It was obviously the little kid who started it first. If the dad was there, the mom wouldn't be bullied and beaten and wouldn't have to apologize, and he wouldn't be treated harshly by the teacher. I put my hands on the steering wheel, not knowing what to say. From the time Max was born to now, Eric has spent less than half a month with his child. It was at that moment that I suddenly felt tired and thought about giving up. But Eric, whose knowledge was still limited to 8 years ago, couldn't explain these things clearly. I didn't want to waste time talking to him anymore. I looked at Eric coldly and said, "You have countless ways to figure out the whole thing, but you just don't believe it." 11. Eric has been sitting outside my house. The weather in early autumn was gradually getting colder. He had not yet recovered from his serious illness and had lost a lot of weight. He sat there stubbornly in his thin hospital gown, not moving at all. I found it a little funny to see him like this through the window, because there were countless times when I wanted to see him and I could only wait for him outside his secretary's office like this. Finally, his secretary had to bite the bullet and come over to invite me to go back. "Mrs. Perkins, the boss is busy, and you didn't make an appointment in advance." After that, every time I wanted to contact him, I had to call his secretary's office to make an appointment to see when he was free. After that, I never contacted him again. I glanced away and stopped looking, leaving him to freeze outside the door. After I finished tutoring Max with his homework, I looked up and saw him lying on the stairs, probably fainted. I thought about it and called his assistant. It wasn't because I was soft-hearted, but if he froze to death outside my house, I would get into trouble if I couldn't explain it clearly. His assistant quickly came with the ambulance, and not long after they left, Eric's mother came to the door. I can shut out Eric and Emma, but I can't deny the door to my elders. When Eric started his business, I was the most suitable daughter-in-law in her eyes. At that time, Eric didn't make much money. Every time Eric and I went back to see her, she would hold my hand and look at me kindly, saying, "Good boy, you have suffered. It is a blessing for our Perkins family to have you by Eric's side. If Eric dares to bully you, just tell me." After Eric's career gradually got on track, she also said to me with a smile, "Grace, it's not that I don't love you. It's just that Emma is more suitable for Eric than you. You should understand the good intentions of a mother, right?" Emma, indeed, her family background, education and looks are all more outstanding. Good birds choose the right trees to roost in. I don't blame Eric's mother for being cold, but it's really not the case that I can sit down and drink tea with her without any grudges. Of course, she was also uncomfortable, so after a few pleasantries she went straight to the point. "Grace, you're a good kid. I know you and Eric are going through a divorce. But you know Eric's current situation. To be honest, I wouldn't bother you if I could avoid it, but Eric only has you in mind now." He fainted again this time. The doctor said that we should not stimulate him and should let him do what he wants. This will help his recovery. I hope you can take care of him after he is discharged from the hospital. His amnesia won't last forever. Once he recovers these 8 years of memory, everything will be fine. Of course, her request was just right. If she hadn't threatened at the end, she would have said, "You know, you and Eric are divorced, and we didn't intend to fight with you for Max's custody. Of course, they don't intend to compete with me because she is waiting for Emma to give her a grandson with better genes." What he meant now was just to threaten me with the custody of Max to make me obey. My back teeth are almost broken. But the only thing I have learned from my experiences over the years is to smile no matter what happens. So I smiled a little and said, "I'll take good care of Eric." 12. I went to pick up Eric the day he was discharged from the hospital. Emma stood outside the ward with red and swollen eyes, because Eric became impatient when he saw her and was very resistant to her approach. Having lost the memories of the love that grew over time, Eric hated himself for being fickle and changing his mind 8 years later based on his moral values. He didn't understand why he became a scumbag. That's why he hates Emma. Emma saw me with tears in my eyes and glared at me fiercely, then warned me, "Grace, don't be complacent, he just forgot about me. He'll remember that day." I glanced at her indifferently and said nothing. I have never felt proud, I just felt burdened. When I pushed the door open, I saw Eric sitting on the hospital bed and instructing his assistant. He looked very indifferent while handling official business, an expression I have often seen in recent years. He raised his head when he heard the voice, and when he saw me, a smile gradually emerged from his cold eyes, but perhaps because my expression was too distant, the curve of his lips slowly fell again. "Looks a little lost." Yes, in his memory, at that time I was Grace who happily accompanied him to suffer in the basement. At that time he even gave me the vegetables and meat in the fried noodles. We found joy in hardship together. I was his strongest support. Compared with the gap now, it is normal that he cannot accept it. He forced himself to cheer up and smiled again. As the president of Irving Technology, Perkins' tone could almost be described as flattering. He said, "Grace, you are here to pick me up." I didn't say anything. I knew he was playing the emotional card. On the way back home, his assistant kept trying to find topics to talk about. He asked me, "Grace, it seems like every time I'm in the worst situation, you're the one who picks me up." When he got drunk at the farewell dinner with his roommates after graduating from college, when he drank with investors and clients until he had stomach bleeding after graduating and starting a business, when he was sick and hospitalized and I stayed by his bedside all day and all night, he encountered countless embarrassing moments like this along the way. I accompanied him through many silent and unknown nights, listening to him talk about his ideals and ambitions when he was drunk. At that time, I stood by his side quietly with a smile on my face, firmly believing that all the scenes he described could be realized one by one. Then he got through the most embarrassing time and showed his most glorious side to Emma. So his mentioning of the past doesn't move me at all, it only makes me feel more disgusted and embarrassed, just like when Grace, who once believed in him foolishly, was dissected and placed in formalin for people to see naked. I just felt difficulty breathing, and it was a suffocating feeling for me. I interrupted Eric. I think the disgust in my eyes must have hurt him, but I couldn't help it. I tried my best to speak to him in the calmest tone. "Eric, I know you have forgotten what happened in the past 8 years, But for me, the hurt of these 8 years still exists. I can't calm down and reminisce about the past with you. Just treat it as a good deed and don't use the past to irritate me." He was stunned for a moment and then he calmed down. Then after a long time, I heard a very light apology. His eyes were red and he said, "I'm sorry." I sneered. Teen. I was willing to take care of Eric only because of Max's custody. The doctor said that Eric should not be provoked forcefully, so I just treated him like air. Max was doing his homework when we walked back together. After throwing Eric into the living room, I went into the kitchen. When I came out of the kitchen, I saw Eric standing awkwardly behind Max, probably looking at Max's homework. He really didn't know how to be a father. I think he probably wanted to take advantage of Max's homework to teach him and get closer to him. But Max's studies have never worried me, so he just smiled and said, "This child is really smart." He raised his hand to touch Max's head, but Max turned his head slightly to avoid it. Then he looked up at Eric silently, ran to my legs and asked, "Mom, is there anything I can help you with?" I looked back and saw Eric's hand in midair. After a while, his fingers curled up slightly. He lowered his head and slowly withdrew his hand, looking inexplicably lonely. In fact, I have always hoped that Max could grow up in a healthy family. I don't want my children to be involved in adult matters. Don't think that children don't understand anything. Children are most sensitive to the relationship between their parents. Max is not close to Eric. There's nothing I can do about it. 14. Actually, there was no bed for Eric to sleep in the house, and he probably understood that he was unwelcome, so he said he would sleep in the living room. When I got up to drink water at night, I saw him watching the projection in the living room. The lights in the living room were off and he turned off the volume. The modeled images projected on his face made him look very focused and serious. I walked over and found him watching our wedding video. The projection was very large and it was showing the scene where we said our vows. I remember that time the MC asked Eric and I to take the oath. I leaned over and whispered in his ear, and then his eyes turned red. Everyone started to make a fuss, thinking that I was saying some very sentimental love words to him. But only the two of us know that what I said to him at the time was, "Eric, let's just stay in this marriage. If you let me down like this, don't ever expect me to take the initiative to withdraw, and let you and Emma be together openly and naturally. I want you to be forever dishonest, always like mice that hide during the day and come out at night, and only be able to have a secret love affair in a place where there is no light for the rest of your life." What a pity. Eric and I have been together since our sophomore year. Although I have always said that I have given my all in a relationship, it must be mutual for it to work. He was tolerant and indulgent towards me. He would wait for me downstairs of my dormitory while I slowly put on makeup, buy me breakfast every morning, and always satisfy my needs. One Chinese New Year, my parents had a fight and were about to divorce, and I cried to him on WeChat. The next day, he appeared in front of me, exhausted, traveling across half the country, and told me not to cry. I suddenly had appendicitis in my senior year. He was busy defending his thesis at that time, but he stayed in the hospital from beginning to end. He also took care of me after the operation. He has severe mysophobia, but during that time he even washed my socks for me. There were so many moments of love like this. At least at that moment, he never seemed to think of marrying anyone else and was always determined to choose me. At that time, we probably didn't expect that many years later, we would be at loggerheads at the wedding we had been looking forward to for a long time, and it seemed like we had not a single nice word to say to each other. Eric closed his eyes in pain and pressed his temples hard. I didn't know if he was asking me or himself. He kept muttering, "How could this happen, Grace? How did we end up like this? How could I do this to you?" He looked up at me. His features were still handsome, but his brows were tightly furrowed. He looked like he was in extreme pain. He raised his hand to cover his heart. His eyes were as dark as the darkest night. He looked at me so intently with a mixture of guilt, confusion, and pain. He asked me desperately, "I always wanted to give you the best in the world, Grace. How come one day I would do this to you?" I almost cried when I heard this. In all the years that Eric and I had been fighting, he never felt sorry for me. He just felt sorry for Emma because he let her follow him for so long without any status. It turns out that when everything returns to the starting point, look at the current ending. You feel like you owe me. He murmured a lot, and at the very end, he looked up at me and asked me in a very soft voice, "Do you still love me?" I could only watch him suffer. Of course I don't love him anymore. I'm not saying this to show off. If you had experienced these 8 years, you would empathize with my resentment and relief. 15. I don't know when the catalyst for Eric and Emma's love began. They are in the same company, have the same philosophy, and work together day and night. It seems natural for them to change their minds. But in fact, no matter what the result is now, I believe Eric struggled and restrained his own heart in the beginning. 6 years ago, the most obvious evidence was that he began to be distracted at home occasionally. One night, his phone vibrated for a long time, but he didn't answer it. He just stared at the vibrating phone in a daze. I came out of the study, feeling a little surprised, and asked him, "Are you not going to answer it?" He suddenly came to his senses, looked up at me, and then picked up the phone in front of me with great difficulty. I couldn't tell what the other end said. His tone was very cold. He just said, "Sorry, I don't have time. Let's talk about business tomorrow." After hanging up the phone, I asked him who he was. He said that Emma had discovered a technical problem in the company and asked if he could come over to discuss it now. I looked at him steadily. It was a tacit understanding among adults that some things didn't need to be said too clearly. I believe that anyone who was not a fool could feel such a straightforward intention. But at that time, I actually always believed that Eric would handle it. He may admire Emma, and besides admiring her, he may also feel that I wish I were single now. But I know that he will not betray me with this little appreciation and affection. We have been together for far too long. Sure enough, when we went to bed at night, he hugged me tightly from behind and said, "Grace, the company is now slowly getting back on track. Let's get married by the end of the year." I said yes. He paused and slowly tightened his arm around my waist, then said in a low voice, "I will have a good talk with her as soon as possible." He didn't say who she was, but we all knew it. I put my hand on the back of his hand and sighed. Okay. 16. I don't know what Eric and Emma talked about at that time. In fact, I really wanted to ask him at that time, "Can your company not operate without this employee?" But he was discussing a new round of financing at the time, and personnel changes might lead to some adverse effects. In addition, Emma was also the core of the project. I thought about it and decided to hold back what I was about to say. I have always been understanding and thought about his difficulties from his perspective. I didn't expect that after he took his team to City B to talk to investors, the whole world would have changed when he came back. I was actually going there at that time, but just before leaving, Eric's mother was suddenly in a car accident and broke many bones. The most serious one was 2 broken ribs, which required surgery to reconnect. Eric comes from a single-parent family. His mother is seriously injured and is bedridden. After the operation, she cannot take care of herself and needs someone to take care of her. Caregivers cannot always be perfect, and he cannot be completely at ease. In order to allow him to discuss things with peace of mind, I stayed in City A to take care of his mother. He led the team to stay in City B for 2 weeks, and I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. Because I didn't want to disturb him and I was also busy in the hospital, we only made a few phone calls during these 2 weeks. Every time, I would quickly tell him about his mother's condition and hang up. I am the only daughter in the family and was raised in the palm of my parents' hands. I was a person who could get lost in my own neighborhood, but during that time I registered at the hospital, went through the hospitalization procedures, paid the fees, found the building, floor and room number for Eric's mother, went through various complicated admission procedures, went to the cafeteria, got water, looked for a microwave oven, and found a place to buy daily necessities. I had to wait outside the operating room, and after the operation I had to take care of his mother's washing, physiology, massage and diet. At that time, I curled up in a chair, staring at his mother's electrocardiogram that sent out alarms from time to time after the operation, and I didn't dare to close my eyes. By the time his mother was able to get out of bed and walk, I fainted in the hospital corridor due to excessive fatigue and hypoglycemia. When I woke up after the glucose drip, I lay on the hospital bed and saw the photos of our mutual friend's celebration party posted in the group. It looked like another world, full of noise and bustle, singing and dancing. They raised their glasses and laughed in celebration. In the photo, Emma was sitting next to Eric, laughing so hard that she fell on him. Eric tilted his head and looked at her, with a smile on his face, also a happy smile. His other hand was loosely protecting her behind her back, as if he was afraid that she would laugh too happily and accidentally fall. It was a half-hug protective gesture. 17. I don't know what happened to them during those 2 weeks in City B. But it is not difficult to guess the hotbed for love. They work side by side day and night, had a high degree of compatibility in career philosophy, shared professional knowledge, and experienced the hardships of negotiating with investors together. Maybe it was when we worked overtime together at night to discuss and submit proposals. Maybe it was the tacit understanding of coffee every day. Maybe it was the ambiguous atmosphere of having supper together late at night. Or maybe it was Emma's shining confidence when she talked about technical algorithms. These countless moments constitute the reasons why Eric's heart is moved. Although immoral, Gustave Le Bon said it a long time ago in his The Crowd. In its eternal conflict with reason, emotion has never lost. It was probably the 3rd week after I came back from City B. One time when I went to the bathroom, I saw him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing over and over again in front of the mirror. "Grace, let's break up." After a pause, he adjusted his expression and said, "Grace, I'm sorry, I like someone else." "Grace, I'm sorry. I'll give you shares and compensate you for the loss of your youth over the years, but I really like someone else. Let's break up." "Grace, He probably felt it was ridiculous himself. He said the lines over and over again. Finally, he suddenly punched himself in the mirror. Then I heard him curse in a low voice. "Eric, you are crazy." I tiptoed away and saw a WeChat message Emma sent to Eric. She asked, "When are you going to confront her? The longer you put off relationships, the worse it will be for everyone." I actually thought a lot during that time, but of course I didn't make a big fuss. Eric also didn't say the breakup lines he had practiced, but before he said it, his mother came to me first. At that time, Irving Technology had raised billions in its Series B financing. The tone of her voice when speaking to me was different from before. She was condescending and arrogant, and her words and expressions implied that I was no longer worthy of her son. I don't know if you can understand my anger at that time. I am not a bad person. Eric and I are in the same school, just with different majors. I have been with him all the way to now. What's more, during the time she was in the hospital, I took care of her almost like my own mother. Until now, I have fallen into such a situation where I am despised by others. In general romance novels at this point in time, cannon fodder like me is better off being tactful and leaving on my own. But I was young at that time and I did things at all costs. I was despised by others in both open and covert ways, and I was let down by my lover who I had been in love with for several years. I was filled with anger and grievance at the time, and I only thought of one thing: let's all be unhappy together. 18. That night, when Eric came back, I sat on the sofa, looked up at him quietly, and said only one sentence. "Eric, I'm pregnant. Don't you want to break up with me? Doesn't your mother want a better daughter-in-law? I just won't let you have your wish." Eric wouldn't let me abort the baby. As expected, he was stunned at first, and after a long while, he managed to pull up the corners of his lips, as if he was smiling, and asked in surprise, "Really?" I turned my eyes away, wondering if anyone had ever told him that his acting was terrible. But I don't want to expose him. This is how we got married. 19. Before we got married, Emma called him and I answered the phone. When I picked up the phone, I could clearly hear her crying. I believe anyone who heard her would feel sympathy for her. She said, "Eric, in the end you still chose her." She cried for a long time. Finally, I said quietly on the other end of the phone, "Have you cried enough? Eric is writing wedding invitations. Do you want me to send you a copy?" The voice on the other end choked up and then hung up the phone. Of course, Emma took revenge a long time later. At that time, Eric and I had completely broken up and hated each other. One night, Max had a high fever and kept calling for his dad in the hospital. When I called Eric, it was Emma who answered the phone. She smiled as soon as she answered the phone and said, "Why are you in such a hurry? Eric is setting off fireworks for me on the top floor of the Twin Towers. Do you want me to take a picture and share it with you?" I was standing in the hospital corridor and looking out the corridor window. I could see brilliant fireworks in the distant sky. That day was Valentine's Day. That was the last phone call I ever made to Eric. None of us were happy after marrying Eric out of revenge. At the beginning, Eric actually tried very hard to return to his family. I don't know how he talked with Emma, But after we got married, Emma resigned from the company. Things seemed to end here, but a week before Emma left, her previous chat records with Eric were printed out and posted on every wall in the Irving Technology office, including several relatively private photos she had sent to Eric. There is also a big red painted lettering that says, "Die Mistress." That's what caused Eric and I to fall out. His eyes were red, veins on his forehead were throbbing, and he tried to control his emotions in front of me and asked me, "Grace, why are you doing this? I've already married you as you wished, and Emma has also resigned from the company. Why do you have to kill her and humiliate her? I have no way to defend myself in this matter. I was pregnant at that time and on the verge of collapse every day. If it were me now, Grace, who is rational and calm and does not love Eric, I would calmly retrieve the surveillance video, find the hired workers who posted those chat records and private photos late at night, and then invite them to Eric and ask them to find the employers who contacted them and put them in front of Eric. But I was devastated and desperate at that time. I sharply asked Eric in response to his questioning, if she didn't seduce other people's boyfriends or husbands, how could she be caught and humiliated? She deserved it. Eric slapped her hard and blurted out, "She never seduced me. I couldn't help myself. I feel guilty. I changed my mind." His words and the slap in the face severed all the affection we had for each other over the years. He left after the fight. During that time, he stayed with the fragile Emma, who was emotionally broken and severely depressed and wanted to commit suicide because of the privacy leak. After helping her completely walk out of the shadow, they decided to abandon all worldly things, break through numerous obstacles, and be together. I held on to the identity of Mrs. Perkins with a clear mind, so that neither of them would ever get what they wanted. 20. Eric asked me if I still loved him. I could only look him in the eyes calmly and coldly, and answer word by word, "I don't love you anymore, Eric." He sat on the sofa and looked at me. His eyes were as sad as expected. After a while, he asked me, "Is there any chance that we can start over?" I laughed self-deprecatingly and looked at him. "Eric, you're saying this now because you've lost your memory. If you think about what happened in the past 8 years, I'm afraid you wouldn't even be willing to sit down and talk to me quietly like this." He was overwhelmed by the impact of all this, and was in so much pain that he lost all expression. His face was hidden in the dark night without lights. After a long while, he said in a low voice, "I don't believe it, Grace. I don't believe I won't love you. I don't believe I will hurt you like this. I have a heart of stone," and was not moved at all when I heard that. I said, "When you remember, you will apologize to Emma for what you said today." 21. Eric began to clumsily try to integrate into his new life 8 years later. He began to please Max. I don't know how he could put down his work in the company. When I opened my eyes, he had already prepared breakfast. It was very nutritious, with a full table of Western and Chinese food. His tall body stood beside the table, inexplicably nervous. He looked at Max and me and said, "I don't know what Max likes, so I prepared a little bit of everything." Max looked at the breakfast on the table with wet eyes, then looked up at Eric and finally looked at me, then walked silently to the refrigerator, took out the sandwich I made for him the night before, climbed onto the chair and sat down to eat. He didn't even touch the colorful breakfast on the table with his chopsticks. Eric lowered his head with a lonely expression, and I heard him sigh very softly. I turned my head away and pretended not to see it. I was delayed for a while in the evening due to an emergency meeting, so I went to pick up Max a little later than usual. When I hurriedly arrived, I found that Eric had already arrived. He was waiting at the entrance of the kindergarten. His figure was as scissors-like. He was tall, and although he had forgotten his memories of the past few years out of habit, he had an introverted demeanor that could not be ignored, so he was very conspicuous in the crowd. Max was coming out of school with his school bag on his back. The traffic at the intersection in front of the school gate was a little chaotic during school dismissal. In fact, motor vehicles were prohibited in front of the school, but for some reason a white car drove in and knocked Max to the ground. Before I ran over, I saw Eric take 2 steps at a time and walk to Max's side. He squatted down to check Max's injury and asked him, "Where are you hurt? Let Daddy take a look." Max looked at him silently and let him roll up his trouser legs. Fortunately, it was only a minor scratch. The driver of the car was cursing, probably saying that Max was running around without eyes. When I ran over, Eric had already stopped the white car. He held Max in his arms and looked at the driver with eyes as sharp as knives, as cold as icicles under the eaves in winter. He said, "Come down and apologize." The tall and burly driver, who was mumbling all the time, shrank back under that look, then said sorry in a timid way. I saw Eric glance at his license plate number calmly. Max was in his arms, staring at him with his dark eyes unblinking. This is the father's desire to protect. I love Max so much, but there is a sense of security that can only be given to the child by his father. After returning, Eric asked his assistant to bring a medicine box. He half knelt in front of Max, put his legs in his arms, and personally applied anti-inflammatory medicine to him. At night, Max knocked on my door with a pillow in his arms and asked me, "Mom, can I sleep with you tonight?" I opened my arms and hugged him. He buried his head in my arms like a little animal and said in a muffled voice, "Mom, is he so nice to us because he has forgotten that aunt?" I hummed and said nothing. He then asked, "Then when he remembers, will he stop being so nice to me?" I didn't know what to say. Max said softly, "Then I don't want to like him anymore. If I like him and he doesn't want us anymore, I will be sad. He is only 6 years old." I don't know how he said what he said or how long he thought about it. The influence of his parents' feelings forced him to mature prematurely. I resented everything except my impulsive marriage, because I dragged my child into this unhealthy entanglement between adults. I kissed the top of his head side and said, "Good boy, go to sleep." Max snuggled into my arms and fell asleep. I looked up. The door was not closed tightly when Max came in. Eric was standing by the door and probably heard everything. His tall body stood there stiff for a long time, his eyes looking at us intently. I don't know if it was an illusion, but I saw a thin layer of mist in his eyes. 22. Eric sat on the sofa and said to me in a voice that was full of self-loathing, "Grace, I really hate myself. Seeing you and Max like this, I really wish I had died the year before you changed your mind." I looked at him in a daze and didn't say anything. It doesn't matter, when you remember everything, you won't hate yourself anymore. 23. Maybe he is worried about Eric and I's current living together life. Emma came several times, but Eric didn't let her in. He had a blank expression and a cold look, which was his usual coldness and alienation towards outsiders. He looked down at Emma, and his tone was full of displeasure of having his territory invaded. "Don't come over again. I don't know why I like you, and I don't know what happened between us before. But during this time, please don't appear in front of my family." He paused. I was familiar with his look. That was Eric 8 years ago. He protected me in the same way when I was bullied in school. Even though he is now the one who bullies and betrays me, he still defends me without changing his expression. He said to Emma maliciously, "You came to pester me even though you knew I had a girlfriend and a family. I don't know why I fell in love with you, but I have to say that his IQ and aesthetics are really not that good. And if I may be frank, in my opinion, you and myself 8 years later are both very stupid people." Emma's face flushed, and then she choked and cried. Eric stood there indifferently, watching coldly. So after that, Emma never came again. Sometimes I would wonder, if Eric continues like this, would I be willing to put aside the past and get back together with him? I thought about it again and again and could only say that I didn't want to, because the betrayal of these 8 years was so unforgettable. It has exhausted all my love for him. Even when I look at him as he was 8 years ago, I can only sigh with emotion. How did time make us like this? Just like on the road of time, we met at 2 forks in the road, then walked hand in hand all the way, and then parted ways on the road together and went further and further along our respective forks in the road. This accident only brought us together for a short time, but the hurt caused by the seemingly harmonious relationship does exist. My heart is old and frail, without any ripples in it any longer. What's more, it's not like Eric will never regain his memory. He's not gonna be like this forever. 24. Eric's second surgery was 4 months later. When I was young, I watched a lot of melodramatic love idol movies about amnesia. After the male or female protagonist lost his or her memory, he or she would always experience the same car accident when his or her memory was restored. But Eric had surgery to remove the blood clot that was pressing on a nerve in his brain. He asked for my opinion before the surgery. He said to me, Grace, I don't want to have this surgery. I looked at him quietly. Amnesia is not an excuse to evade responsibility, Eric. You forgot, but no one else has forgotten except you. All the paths you have chosen are your own. You must always be responsible for your choices. He raised his hands to cover his eyes. But I don't want to face another me. He had no choice. When he left, his assistant came to pick him up to take him to the hospital. The car drove a long way away and Max was still leaning against the window watching. He was so sensible that it made me feel distressed. When I could no longer see him, he turned his head and asked me, "Mom, will he come again?" I smiled and said nothing. I don't care how his surgery went or whether it was successful. Without his intrusion, my life has finally returned to normal, and Max and I are doing our normal business as if he had never been there. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 months later that I met him again. He came to give me the divorce papers. It was late autumn then, and he was waiting under the sycamore tree in front of my house wearing a black coat. I didn't know if it was because of the surgery or for other reasons, but he looked very, very thin, almost emaciated, and there was no color on his face. He quietly watched me walk in, then handed me the divorce agreement. In just a few months he looked tired and seemed to have aged several years. His tone was also calm. Before coming here I thought a lot. The lawyers asked me whether I wanted to draft this divorce agreement. I hesitated for a week, but finally let them draft it. I think you are disgusted from the bottom of your heart when you see me. Letting you go is the last thing I can do for you. I opened the agreement and took a quick look. Most of our property was divided equally. He even gave me half of his shares in Irving Technology. In addition, he gave Max a lot of extra things. The division of property in this divorce agreement can be described as generous. I don't know how his mother and Emma agreed to it. Maybe they don't even know. I put away the divorce agreement and looked up at Eric. He didn't look at me but looked into the distance. I couldn't understand the expression on his face. He said, "The 2 days after I woke up were very painful, Grace. I don't know how we ended up like this." He didn't continue, but I understood. He was successful at a young age, full of energy and vigor. The further and faster he went, the less he missed the past, because a better future was waiting for him. So he went further and further on the road to success. I was just a burden to him at that time. But one day he lost his memory and went back to the past. All the past memories came flooding back to him. He recalled everything from our childhood together to the present when we have changed beyond all recognition. 8 years ago, Eric was stubborn and devoted to me. He was sure that he would never fall in love with anyone else. He wanted to give me everything in the world. He had a sincere heart. But 8 years later, when Eric feels the same state of mind he had 8 years ago and thinks back on how much he hurt me along the way, he should be able to empathize with me better than I did, as it's easy for old friends to change their minds. The only thing that never changes in this world is change itself. I guess only he himself knows the emotions and sighs involved. Turns out that he once loved me in that way. But looking at the divorce agreement, all the blame was put together. He thought about it all 8 years later and finally, from the perspective of Eric, who had completed the book, he expressed to me his guilt and apology for being so late for so many years. The anger that had been pent up in my heart finally dissipated. 25. Eric had become quiet. As his business grew bigger, his temperament became sharper and sharper. But now this sharpness seemed to have suddenly rusted. He looked gloomy and desolate. There is a sense of dejection and self-abandonment. He smiled at me and said, "Can I come visit Max more often in the future?" I didn't say anything and he added nervously, "I'm not trying to fight you for custody, He paused, then laughed at himself. "I just want to fulfill my responsibilities as a father." I nodded slightly and agreed to him. We were silent for a long time. I had nothing to say to him, and he didn't know what to say. We were young lovers, but now we were worse than strangers. He finally nodded at me, as if he was afraid that if he stayed too long, I would look at him with disgust, so he said to me, "Then I'll leave first." Before leaving, he suddenly turned around and asked me, "Grace, is there anything you need me to do?" I looked at him and suddenly smiled at him without any hesitation. Just like when we first got together in college, this smile was gentle and quiet, without any sharp sarcasm or hatred. He looked a little shocked, almost flattered. I looked at him calmly and said, I hope you can give me back the Eric from 8 years ago. Eric, during the time you lost your memory, I thought a lot, and all my frustration and despair were soothed. I think if you hadn't changed your mind and fallen in love with someone else during our long-term love, you would have been a very good husband and a very good father, just like you did during the time you lost your memory. I don't ask anything of you. I just hope you can give me back the Eric I was 8 years ago. But we all know that everything has changed and nothing can go back. You can't be the Eric you were 8 years ago, and I can't be the Grace you were 8 years ago. Let's part ways in peace. Our marriage was not honorable, but the end of it is actually a decent ending. His expression dimmed little by little as I spoke, then he forced a smile and said, I am sorry for you. I smiled and said nothing. I know that all our words have been said at this moment. From now on, the bridge will return to the bridge, the road will return to the road, and when the dust settles, we will still miss it after all. I have made peace with these 8 years. 26. I met Eric and Emma again in the hospital. At that time, Eric and I had been divorced for nearly 5 years, and he and Emma had been married for nearly a year, which was an ending to Emma's 8 years of compromise. In fact, when Eric and I just divorced, Emma came to see me. I just looked at her coldly at that time, and I said one sentence to her so that she couldn't say anything. I said, Emma, Eric and I are divorced. I own half of his shares and Max owns a little. You can calculate how much the combined shares of Max and I are. I don't know if Eric did it on purpose. I have the custody of Max, and the combined shares of Max and I are exactly 1% more than his. That is to say, as long as I want, his hard work and his earthing technology can change hands in an instant. He handed his company over to me, and I could leave him with nothing in an instant. I don't know if this can be considered a kind of compensation from him. Emma's face turned pale. I just looked at her with disgust. If you don't want me to do something, then never bother me again. Finally, I smiled and stabbed her heart one last time. I asked, Emma, how does it feel to be with a man who always feels guilty about others? Her expression changed drastically. It seemed that I had hit a sore spot. I have been hurt in this marriage, and now she and Eric are reaping the consequences. It must be karma. The year after Eric and I divorced and reconciled, I met a very compatible work partner named Samuel Goodwin. He was a very calm, self-controlled, and dedicated person. He never backed down in the face of my hesitation about love. Even Max, who was taciturn and distant, liked him very much, so we got married in the 4th year. That's why I can meet Eric and Emma in the obstetrics and gynecology department of the hospital now. I was 4 months pregnant at the time, and Samuel accompanied me for the prenatal checkup. We had to say hello when we met face to face. Eric's gaze moved from my face to my slightly pregnant belly. His gaze paused, and I saw the protruding blue veins on the back of his hand. His expression was stunned and painful, but he only lost his composure for a few seconds and then he hid his emotions very well. He looked at me and said congratulations with a pale face. I thanked him politely, then looked at the same obstetrics and gynecology sign behind him and expressed the same congratulations. They were all silent. Emma stood aside with a stern face. She must have just gotten pregnant. Her belly was flat and she didn't look pregnant at all. So we said goodbye politely. Later in the parking lot, I met Eric and his mother again. Emma was not there. I only heard a few words from a distance. The wife you carefully selected can't lay eggs. Why did you marry her? I've already told you that the daughter of the Sue family is interested in you. She's from a wealthy family, and she's younger and healthier than Emma. If you ask me, why are you still taking Emma to the hospital and treating her illness? It would be better to divorce her and marry someone else. I actually felt a subtle sympathy for Emma. At the very end, I heard Eric's exhausted voice. His tone was almost pleading. He said, Mom. Eric's mother paused and fell silent. I didn't listen anymore. Samuel carefully helped me into the car. Ever since I became pregnant, he has been taking care of me like a fragile porcelain doll. I felt both amused and annoyed, but I just let him do it. After we got in the car, he kept driving and watching the road while mumbling in my ear. What do you want to eat tonight? I saw you were enjoying the fish head yesterday. Do you want to eat it again today? But it's not good to eat it 2 days in a row. I see Max likes spicy food. How about making a whole hot pot for you too? I leaned my head against the soft backrest and listened to his chatter with a smile. This is the world and fireworks that belong to me. God has never treated me unfairly. For the rest of my life, I will try my best and live a happy life.